second part of Addressing Hard Things, Interview with an Expert. Today, I'm so happy to have our guest speaker with us today, Josephine A. And hi, Joe. I'm so, again, happy to see you today. I'm going to go ahead and read Joe's bio before I hand it over to Joe, and we'll start doing the interview. Before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to be talking about subjects that might be sensitive to you, personal to you, or to those in your community. So when we're going through this webinar today, I encourage you to breathe. Notice what's going on in your body as we're going through our conversations. And if needed, take time, step away, and come back. While we want you to learn, while we do our best learning when we're a little bit uncomfortable, we don't want people to be traumatized, to be emotionally activated, or triggered. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and read Joe's bio. Josephine A. Loren, MST, she, they, is an internationally recognized disabled author and activist. They have been published in outlets like Miss Magazine, Yes, America, Spirituality and Health, and Elite Daily. Joe also consulted on a children's book published by Scholastic, Extraordinary, celebrating neural and physical diversity. As a survivor and the co-founder of INCEST AWARE, Joe serves an alliance of individuals and organizations seeking to improve methods of incest prevention, intervention, recovery, and justice. Say hello to Joe at their website, and then this website is on the screen, but it's josephineann.com. So with that being said, hi, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, Lachey. Thank you so much for being here, or for having me with you today. And I just wanted to thank everyone who is in attendance. It's always, I hold two hats as both the co-founder of INCEST AWARE, as a community organizer, as well as an incest survivor. And it's always so healing to be invited into spaces where, as a survivor and a single subject matter expert, I get to talk about this great harm that was done to me and how we can dream together about changing systems so that people that went through what I went through, one, either don't have to go through it, or if they do, that there's a safe place to land and various support networks in order to help us. So I'm so honored. It's healing for me to be here, and grateful that you've chosen me.
I'm honored and grateful that you said yes. So thank you again so much for being here. So we're going to go ahead and do our first question, if that's okay with you, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the first question is on the screen, and I will read it out loud. What is incest, and how would you describe it?
Yeah, I really want to ground this question in my story. Just to put my own life in context, because that's always really important in our work as advocates, is I was raised by, or my grandfather was raised in a one room house in a coal mine community in West Virginia, with 12 brothers and sisters, and then was drafted into the military, and that's how he escaped poverty, or liberated himself from poverty, and then became a mailman, moved to Huntington Beach, and raised his family after his military career in Huntington Beach, California. My father's side was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, not in so much of a rural community, more in like a suburb. And he moved to Southern California and then met my mother. And so then they got married, and they had me and I have three brothers. Because I really see incest as a culture. And that culture was really alive and really vibrant in my family system. And so what I mean by that is, and it affects all incest families differently, but there was a patriarchal culture in my family, that gave my dad more power than my mother and the children in the house, that allowed for these power over power under dynamics that were so confident, or that we know so much contribute to cultures of sexual violence. My family was Opus Dei Catholic, which is a very kind of conservative wing of the Catholic Church, that is really follows these old rules, about especially like women's bodies being the fault of sexual violence, right? Of men's sexual desires, purity culture. There was really like a lack of sexual education or bodies and boundaries education in my family system that contributed. And then, there was a sibling abuse that was normalized, like, oh, siblings are just playing, or they're just learning, or they're just curious, when really it was violence, and there should have been better boundary settings around that. And then, socially, unfortunately, I didn't get out of the house, or I wasn't learning anything better or different outside of the house. So when I left to go to school, I don't think I received any sort of bodies and boundaries education until I was in the 6th grade. And I was abused starting at the age of 2. So that's a lot of years before I was even given the opportunity to understand this isn't right. Like, your parents who are in charge of creating your worldview and your foundation, are telling you that this is normal, or are glorifying incest, or are justifying it for a number of reasons. And then I get to the 6th grade and I'm like, okay, bad touch, good touch, this is bad touch. What do I do now? And then, like, Lachey's presentation on part 1 was so beautifully showed, there is so little about incest in our society. And there is so little, what is out there is so often misrepresentative of incest, especially in the media. It's often presented as consensual, or it's not clear whether or not it's abuse when it very obviously is. So I met a society that was really not incest aware or incest competent, and so had to really learn these things and uncover them by myself. And that was really, really hard, So when I think about incest, it is exactly what Lachey talked about in part 1, right? It's non-contact abuse, contact abuse, and displays, like child sexual abuse material or other pornography, showing people graphic images. It's emotional abuse too, right? Covert incest. It's using children for your your kind of adult need for emotional intimacy and satisfaction. It is all those things. And it is so pervasive throughout all of our systems, that it can't be reduced or limited to those things.
I mean, you touched on so many things, Joe. I just, especially I think in the media and how it's portrayed, is like, is it really? Because, well, they do this and they act like this, but then this happens, and it's meant to try to diffuse that this is abuse, this is harm,
Right.
and someone is experiencing it, and there can be a stop to it. But
Right.
when we're not sure, when we can't define it, when we can't talk about it, that that perpetuates the cycle. Yeah.
And it really makes survivors, it gives survivors a lack of language to describe their own experiences, to name it as abusive, or we're often very confused. Did I consent to this? Society seems to say that because I participated, I consented. Or was I at fault for seducing the person who harmed me? Research from the 1980s suggests I was. That's not that long ago. I was born in 1986, So there's all these sources of authority that are telling you to gaslight yourself and to not believe in your own experience. And then we have to sort through that, which is not easy.
Not at all. And I think narrowing in a little bit more, that goes to our next question. How has incest particularly impacted rural communities? So you talked a little bit about your story, but our focus stays on rural communities because we know that it happens, and
Mhm.
we're not in any way trying to feed into stereotypes. So that's our focus, right? How do we talk about people who might be removed from resources or all the other reasons that living in a rural community is unique?
Yeah, I'm writing a memoir, and in order to do that, I really had to go backwards and do some genealogical study of my family system. The grandfather I referred to did not tell me that he was raised in a coal mine community, right? He told me that he was raised in a one-bedroom house with 12 brothers and sisters. Um, and that is what I knew, but I knew nothing else. And so it was really fascinating learning about his context. I do not know if my grandfather was sexually harmed. I don't have that information, but he was one of the people who harmed me. And if we think about his context, he has 12, there are 12 of them and the parents all in one room. What does sexual boundaries look like in that context? What does sexual education look like in that context? He was raised in the early 1920s in West Virginia, which I've worked with some folks who are currently working in rural settings in West Virginia, and there's still no talk about bodies, boundaries, and sexuality. So I can make these educated connections that suggest that he got no education on this. There were no actual boundaries within the house because there were class constraints that did not allow the children to be separated or even the parents to be separated from the children. And so like Lachey talked about, right, there are barriers to prevention in all communities. There are barriers to care in all communities. In rural communities, those barriers, as you all already know, I mean, you're the experts in your own context, and Lachey talked about it, but the barriers are about more isolation, often less resources, and really thirdly, and I feel like I want to offer an apology for this, is there's so much social stigma already around incest. And then you get like the double layer of stigma around rural communities and incest. And so even though there isn't a lot of data that suggests that incest is more common in rural communities, there is definitely a social narrative that suggests that it is, which isn't helpful for any of us, right? I was born in Newport Beach, California. My father was a millionaire, and he was abusive to me, and my grandfather was abusive to me. I grew up in a really different context, and yet what we know is that incest happens everywhere. So I think, continuing to dismantle the stigma within rural communities around incest is really important, but it's also really important that we, as people who are not, like myself and others who are not a part of the rural communities, that we really defend you and we stand on your side, and we don't give in to the continued stigma that this happens in this community more than everywhere else.
Dawn, I think really making sure that we pair facts with the experiences of people have who are experiencing incest is important. And I think that feeds again to our next question. Let me make sure I put it on the screen so we're being as accessible as possible. Give me 1 second. There we go. What are some common misconceptions about providing services to survivors of incest? So we might think it might be best to do this thing because of what we know about offering services to survivors of intimate partner violence or working with criminal justice systems or things like that. But what are some common misconceptions about providing services to survivors of incest?
Yeah, I think separating kind of children who have disclosed opposed to adults who have disclosed, because the system and support services work really differently for those populations, is important. For children, obviously, it's always important to recognize they may not have the language. There is so much normalization within the home. They may need to kind of be taught by you that like this isn't right. And, you can help reshape their worldview around what is and isn't appropriate and how they do not deserve to be treated. One thing that we know from child sexual abuse research in general is that buffers, they're called, are people who show children the opposite of abuse. That can be a social worker, a teacher, an uncle, an aunt, a pet, like anyone who kind of shows up as a real loving, safe model. Even if children just have one buffer in their lives, it will make their healing journey so much easier because they always had an example of the alternative of what was happening at home. As opposed to if you don't have the example, that can be really hard. The one other thing I want to say about children is that reincantation is really, really common. So they might often come forward and say this is happening, and then they may recant later. And so to just know that if they're recanting, to question that. When it comes to adult survivors of incest, again, there's really a lack of language. They might, I think starting with education, getting people to understand. I can't even tell you, as a survivor and as someone who does public advocacy work, we are often the ones who are receiving most people's first disclosures because they don't even realize it's incest until I've told my story and I give them that paradigm. And then they say, oh my gosh, that happened to me too. Oh my gosh, I just realized I'm a survivor, right? And then they start to puzzle and their own activations and their nervous system and their life. And like they start doing all that labor that all survivors do to make sense of their experience with this new information that you've shared with them. The one thing that I really want practitioners to understand as a survivor is I think a lot of, especially in kind of Western psychological models, there's this assumption that like everyone has a baseline, like a regulated baseline, that safety is something that we're all born to understand, right? And safety is not something we're born to understand. It is something that we learn. And so there's all this research about the brains of incest survivors and how the neurological cells that tell us like whether or not we are safe don't even exist in our brains. Like we can't even comprehend what safety is like. And so much of your work with survivors is going to be teaching them that, rewiring their brains, their lived experience to understand this is what safety is like, and then to constantly keep reminding them so that they can develop a baseline. And as Lachey's presentation did so beautifully, that is a lifetime of work. That is not short-term labor. That is a lifetime of showing up and being constant and consistent and loving. And I'll say like the people who have most impacted my healing journey are my friends because they're the ones who could commit long-term to that constancy without me having to pay them, right? Or having to be in any type of exchange. They're there just because they want to be, and they show up for me all the time. And that has taught me about what safety is.
There were so many nuggets in there. Like you started talking, I started to take notes. Just about the importance of framing experiences
Yeah,
and not telling people what they experience, but saying
right.
this is what a definition of incest might be. Does it sound like what happened to you? What is that? How does that feel? Right? And the importance of making space for people to have those realizations, like this happened to me, that can be life changing, that can be harmful, that could be scary. Like it can be anger inducing. Like there's so many things that could come out of that. I think the importance about recanting as well, especially when there is this information or narrative that people who experience sexual violence in general are lying, right? But we know there's a lot of reasons why people might say this happened to me and then later might say it didn't happen to me
Right.
for a variety of reasons. And then about safety, oh, that was amazing. Safety is something we learn, right? And this is especially important for people who are survivors of incest because, like you said, this might be something you're born into, and until someone shows you different, you don't know. And then
Yeah.
when you do, there's what do I do about it? How do I stop it? What will other people do about it? What will other people think? All these different things.
That's exactly right. And you know what another element that can be really hard is a lot of children, especially this, I mean, this is true for anyone who has a traumatic experience, is that our memory is affected. And so, especially for children, we have what's called betrayal trauma, or dissociative amnesia. We might forget that it even happened to us and then start remembering later in life. So in my own experience, I was serially abused for years. I also had a seizure disorder and like some digestive health issues. And so by the time I was 18, my body was like, no, like we're done. You know, like I could barely function. I was having a lot of health problems. And I didn't recover my memories till I was 24, but it really started coming out somatically. So I was having night terrors almost every night of being sexually abused. Um, uh, my mental health plummeted really quickly as soon as I moved out of the house. I played water polo growing up, and one of my therapists once said to me, I said, like, how come I was so high functioning for so long and then I just crashed? And she literally said, you can't tread water forever. You know, at some point you're going to lose, you're going to lose your steam and your momentum. So to really honor, there's a lot of research out there that suggests that recovered memory is not real. There has been a lot of kind of institutional and historical oppression in all levels, like the medical system, the legal system, social services, the family system, obviously, against incest, and the nuance and complexity of what it's like to hold this history in your body and to cope with it and then to try to heal from it in a society that doesn't even want to talk about it. So if someone comes to you with a sense of flashbacks or memories or even somatic or embodied like reactivity that they don't understand, we never want to say like, oh, you're probably an incest survivor, but to start holding space for those conversations and that possibility that someone could be in the process of recovering their memory, and then to validate that process.
Thank you so much for that. We've already started to kind of answer that next question that we were going into. But what are some of the most helpful responses you've seen in your experiences with survivors, or services, responses, support that have been the most helpful in supporting survivors of incest?
Yeah, I really love that. So, you know, it's tricky. One of the things that we've coined at Incest Aware is called the incest gap. And so what we mean by that is that there really is a lack of effective methods of incest. And then we talk about these four verticals. So prevention, intervention, recovery, and justice. Um, and so I say I fell into the incest gap, right? When I remembered, I disclosed to my family and was like pretty immediately told I needed to forgive and move on without any sort of accountability of the people who harm me or assurance that the next generation would be safe. And so I really felt like they were choosing the people who harmed over me and that I had to choose my safety over my family. So what experience, whether, there's a Dr. Jennifer Freyd, F-R-Y-E-D, or F-R-E-Y-D, sorry, who talks about institutional betrayal, that like so many institutions historically have failed incest survivors throughout history. And again, that this has been very intentional, that this is not an accident that we don't talk about incest. When I think about the opposite of that, when I think about, what went well in my healing journey, when my first memories came back, I went to a therapist who validated my memories and immediately taught me about the incest family, which was at the time kind of a model to help understand how people get away with incest within family systems. When I think about community support, I was so disabled by the difficulty of my childhood that I couldn't support myself, and I knew I couldn't go back to family. And so my friends opened their homes to me, and these were new friends. Like these weren't these weren't friends from childhood. You know, these were friends I was just meeting. They really took me in and kept me off the streets. They kind of offered me the social services that at the time social services could not offer me. Um, when I think about good examples of approaching like the anti-rape movement or social services, it's like, it's this, right? It's saying, hey, it's Lachey's presentation. It's like saying, hey, we recognize the gap you fell through, Joe, and we want to help solve that. And here are a number of ways that we can help solve that. I think it's important that we anticipate backlash as we drive this movement forward to support incest survivors, because it's always present in history. There's always these like incest awareness movements, and then we get pushed back down underground really quickly because of social backlash. So expect it. Let's think about resiliency tools to ensure that we are able to continue to choose what is called institutional courage, right? It's like, how do we as institutions, as individuals, as communities show up courageously, so that survivors don't have to do this by ourselves, which is really what we've had to do throughout history. As much as we see the historical oppression of incest, we see survivors telling their stories over and over again in literature, in various other art forms, through research. We see survivors, you know, telling their stories of liberation and the language they came to understand their experience. And we really need support from all levels to continue to do that and to ensure the next generation is safe, because that's so much the priority of our nervous systems. We are definitely menders, right? We just want to say, oh my gosh, this happened to me, and I don't want it to happen to anyone else. So please, support me in this work, and let's think of and design programming and systems that make it easier for us to do the work.
100%, absolutely. I have nothing to add except that I fully agree with everything that you shared right now. Um, Next question kind of goes more into the prevention side. So we
Mhm.
know that we can continue to support people. People who disclose have said this happened to me. We also want to believe that it can end, that it doesn't have to keep going. And as the story from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, NSVRC, they tell the river story. Instead of just helping people out of the river, how about we stop people from putting other people in the river,
Right.
right? And so the question that we have now is about prevention, and it's about rural grantees specifically, right? This webinar was paid for because we're a part of the LVW Rural TA project. And so if relevant costs are included in your approved budget, rural grantees can use some of the money given, up to 30%, to do prevention work.
Mhm.
So that's your little caveat. If you want to do prevention work, make sure you clear with your grant manager first. But what are some things we can do to help prevent incest?
I love this. You know, my my professional background, I have 2 degrees, but one is a master's in theology, theological studies, which is religion. I focus on Catholic theology. I was a teacher for a few years and a campus minister, where I really learned how to listen, mostly to people, understand their needs. And then I left teaching, I left the Catholic Church, and I became a a designer. I got into the design industry kind of on like a cool whim, and started really learning about design thinking, which is this process of like, how do we dream and envision? What is a process that will help us create brand new services that have not yet been created? And how do we do it efficiently, effectively, and within the constraints or the barriers or boundaries that we have, right? So what I love about the design thinking model, and I would love to support your organizations in this process, is really thinking about starting with context, right? That you're all the experts in your own context, and you know what's going to work and what's not going to work. A lot of the literature and the resources around, especially child sexual abuse, but I would say, you know, adult sexual abuse as well, doesn't focus on the nuances of incest, doesn't always focus on the nuances of rural communities, like how close everyone is, right? How everyone knows everyone, how people aren't necessarily going to go to social service centers because like the person who works at the rape crisis center is also your neighbor, like there's this gap to even wanting, besides not knowing how to disclose or if to disclose, or even if the abuse is wrong, there's this distance or hesitation to even lean into support systems, right? And so if we're starting from there as our constraint or barrier, then the question is, how do we design around that? And I think there's some really exciting things to think about. I mean, this is, as an anti-incest activist, I always say, like, the more there is gap, there is opportunity, right? And so we have such an opportunity to be designing together on how we can create programming. And so, a few ideas just off the top of my head is there are helplines that do not direct people back to local service centers. So What's Okay is a youth helpline that I support. They're a great organization out of Massachusetts, and they receive national calls, chats, texts. And they have a small team, that are not located within your communities likely. And they field all those calls. For adults, they also run a helpline called Stop It Now. So these are really great places where people can receive confidential, anonymous support if they have questions, concerns, behavior. And this includes people who are at risk to harm. They're all trained to also receive support from people who are at risk to harm. So if you notice that people aren't utilizing your services, let's connect to Jenny Coleman at Stop It Now, who runs Stop It Now and What's Okay. And let's build these relationships with organizations that can offer trusted resources to people where they might start getting help. Another idea is, Incest Aware, we don't have funding yet. And so we've really built our organization off of volunteerism and generosity, which I think is beautiful. And it's time to get funding. But we want to really build a digital community platform that will allow people to get help virtually. So there may be barriers to get virtual help with, parent controls on the internet or library controls on the internet, but maybe even just offering computer access that has digital communities where people can learn about their experiences independently could be another way for them to start thinking about liberation and about healing. I also think that peer-to-peer support and education is really important. So especially incest survivors, they're generally not going to go to parents. They're not going to go to family. They're not going to go to mandated reporters. And so they may just go to their peers. So really educating educate the youth on how to hold disclosures, what to do about them. And then I think too, parent, both adult and child boundaries, bodies, and sexuality education in whatever language suits your context. So in Seattle, a friend of mine runs a program where she can use the body language, she can use anatomically connect language with kids and say this is your vagina, or this is your penis, or this is your vulva. Whereas when I work with people in West Virginia, they're if a child came up to me and talked about his body or her body or their body that way, they would their parents, social services would be called on their parents, child social services. So create language in the community that people can agree on that suits the community. So whether that says, hey, someone's touching my bathing suit zone, and I've heard that's not a good idea, and also adult education. So many of us were not raised in consent culture. I was not raised in consent culture. It is something I am still learning. So if we know that incest and the culture of incest, as I described in the beginning of this call, is passed down intergenerationally, we really have to educate, unfortunately, often our elders and the adults in our communities, because they haven't been taught yet either. And that education can be fun, so designing things that are community oriented, that are fun, that are game-like. Activism as play is always a fun thing to think about. So those are some ideas.
Thank you so much for that. I wrote down where there is more gaps, there is more opportunities, and the importance of peer-to-peer support. Um, and then I was checking for some questions in the chat, and someone asked the two organizations that you named. One of them is What's Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is Stop It Now. Correct? Did you name
Yes.
another organization? I just want to make sure.
No, just those two. And Stop It
Okay.
Now and What's Okay, both are Stop It Now runs both programs, and I'm happy to
Okay.
connect you all. Jenny is a really great friend and mentor, and yeah, they do great work. So check them out.
Okay. And so we are almost done with the formal questions that I wanted to ask Joe. And so I'm going to put our last formal question on the screen. But hopefully while we're kind of wrapping up our formal piece, that you all put more questions in the Q&A, because we still have about 20 minutes left to take audience questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and ask Joe my last question. If I can get the share to come back on. There we go. What are three key takeaways you want advocates working with rural sexual violence survivors to get from our conversation today? So if they only take away three things, they had to take calls or other things, they weren't sure what sort of things we were discussing are, or they weren't here for part one. What are three things that you want people to know?
Yeah, first and foremost, and Lachey, I was really grateful that you centered this in your presentation too, is to really get to know survivors. Survivors have really been at the forefront of the anti-incest movement throughout history. We have been the ones who have really, kind of had to bear the burden of the backlash the most. And so we have a lot of knowledge in our bodies and in our writing and in our work that can contribute to your program designs or, the various things that you're creating, or even just the way you're thinking about this. I really loved, Lachey, that you had suggested, working with survivors in the community, which can be really helpful. And it could be really difficult, especially in rural communities, because that would assume people are disclosing, coming forward, coming up with a language that they've done that labor, which they may not have done. And so I want to offer the Incest Aware Alliance as another resource. I am both an expert and a learner of the anti-incest movement, and how we can continue to improve methods of prevention, intervention, recovery, and justice in various communities, looking for really contextual, culturally affirming responses. But I also am connected to over 65 other individuals and organizations globally doing this work. And so you don't have to start from scratch. You have a community to come to that you can talk to about this. I also want to name that, like, many of you on the call may be people who have experienced incest. Maybe, you've been touched by it directly. Maybe you've been a person who has harmed unintentionally. Maybe you grew up in a system or a family system where this was really active. So we want to be a part of that process too. For those of us who hold those dual or triple hats of survivor and activist and supporter, how we can, support you. So you're more than welcome to reach out to me to get to know the Alliance. You're welcome to join the Alliance if you'd like. To keep up with our newsletter, you can go onto our website, incestaware.org, and just scroll down to the bottom and sign up for our newsletter. We send out one email a month. If you want to join Incest Aware, if you want to join the Alliance, we meet every other month over Zoom to just chat with each other, get to know each other. It's free. There's no, it's more just kind of grassroots organizing, keeping up with what people are working on, where you can find resources, etc. Our goal is really just to help build like a strong and unshakable movement for the incest community so that our generation can start that foundation, and then other other generations can keep building upon it, as opposed to the foundation being pushed underground, which we've seen through so many times throughout history. And then, the second part would just be to be as comprehensive as possible. Like, so there's adult on child abuse, there's child on child abuse, especially between siblings. And then I think I imagine too, there's a lot of adult on adult abuse, particularly with disabled adults, with elderly adults, right? Anyone who's vulnerable, we know in our society is at higher risk to be abused. So to just make sure that we are being comprehensive, and then yeah, to just know that incest is complex, and it's not an easy subject, and it's not going to be an easy problem to solve. And so just learning to sit with us in that complexity if you're not already, and to not think of quick, easy answers, but to hold the complexity, digest the complexity, like you were saying, Lachey, like, get people out of the river. It's like, yes, but also like spend time with us in the river. Learn what it's like to be raised in a river. Learn what it's like to not know how to differentiate between you and the river, right? And be with us in that space. And then we can start talking about how do we do the labor to differentiate ourselves from the water, to pull ourselves out of those currents, to live a really different life, to retrain our nervous systems and build safe community. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I think to offer out, like, Joe is such an incredible wealth of knowledge, and if you all want to consult, so you can get TA from us, yes. And if you want to consult with Joe directly, you all have the ability to do that. INCEST Aware offers training, technical assistance. That is how I found Joe. I was looking for resources, and Joe's name popped up. So again, I'm not doing it. TA providers also need technical assistance. So again, thank you so much. And Nora is going to put Joe's information in the chat if you want to connect with Joe. If you want to support Joe and INCEST Aware, that information will also be in the chat. And now we're going to start to answer some audience questions that we've already gotten. And so I'll hand it over to Nora to read our first question in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. This is Nora, providing tech support, and there's a question in the Q&A box. Would it be appropriate to screen for incest during intake at a domestic violence sexual assault organization, historical or current? And if so, how?
That is a great question. So incest screenings were a thing, believe it or not, like in the 80s. The second wave of feminism really drove the anti-rape movement in the United States. It's when the Rape Crisis Center started to be formed. And so you would go to the doctor, and it was kind of almost like an ACEs questionnaire, but it would say, like, are you experiencing sexual violence or incest in the home? There was not a lot of stigma around the word incest. And then there was this major backlash in the 90s that like really pushed it back underground. I do think it would be appropriate to screen for it. Again, like we often experience in survivor communities, we may hit barriers around ontology, right? How survivors identify themselves. They may not know they're an incest survivor, even if they are. So it'd be really interesting to think about what language you use, or even, saying, hey, this is a educational resource on this type of harm. Are you experiencing this? I remember the first time I went to a Planned Parenthood, and this is a great example of good support, right? They handed me a card, and it said, like, it was like a business card, and it said on it, do you feel safe in all of these ways? Or do you feel that someone is doing harm to you in all these ways? And it just listed a bunch. It was like verbal, coercive control, sexual, and then you could say yes or no. And then that would lead the conversation. And it was a really healing moment for me to be like, in the past, I did not feel safe. I was not safe, and I am now. So yeah, excited to think through and dream with you how we can do that on intake forms and creative ways to do it. And I think that people, there are organizations who are modeling that we can turn to and ask for help.
The only thing I would add to that, Joe, is like we know that intakes are something that a lot of us are required and that it can be helpful parts of the healing experiences. I have said that. And my only questions would be if someone says yes, they have experienced incest, what would be the result of that? So intakes are to screen for things and then to take action in some way or intervene in some way. And so, like, what is our plan if someone says, yes, I have experienced that, to make sure that we're prepared for that question as well.
Thank you for
And
saying that. And that's so
yeah.
important with mandated reporting specifically. So if it, if it's an adult, it's different because adults have more rights. But with children, if there would want to be some training like we often do in schools, right, around like hypothetical language or whatnot, because of unfortunately like the mandated reporting policies and how they don't always serve incest survivors very well. So again, this is like the complex, there's not always easy answers to these questions, but I'm here for you and with you in dreaming about solutions.
Thank you so much, Joe. And the other piece I was going to say about that is being, again, very mindful of the language that we're using to ask these questions. So in particular, boy children, if you say like has someone sexually assaulted you or has someone touched you before, but if you ask questions, have you been made to touch someone before, or has someone touched you in a way that made you excited, right? That might get a different answer than have you been sexually assaulted, has someone raped you? And these questions that on the surface are very direct and might get very direct answers, but they are not going to resonate with the language that children use, that survivors use to talk about their experiences, and that would make someone feel open and honest about feel open and honest to respond about what actually happened to them in particular. So, Nora, I think there was another question that I was seeing. Oh, okay. There's in the Q&A. So if you could read that one, thank you.
Yes. Okay, we have another question says, advocates in Colorado are no longer mandatory reporters. How do you see this impacting incest survivors?
Oh, that's such good news. Mandated reporting is really complicated, as I'm sure you're all already aware. I think its intentions were good, right? That people would utilize the system to get the support they need, but especially with incest cases, the nuclear family is already so isolated within itself, and there's so much social kind of glorification around the family. And so mandated reporting already isn't really serving families very well because either people aren't reporting, especially when it comes to incest, they're not going to report someone they love, they're economically dependent on, they feel like ontologically dependent on, right? Like they share the last name and identity of their little tiny cohort of a community. And then if someone does report, it often tears the family apart, right? The child is taken into foster care, which can lead to even more problems, more sexual violence, etc. So I think the nice thing about advocates not being mandated reporters is it really gives you time to strategize a care plan with them, a liberation plan with them, right? So depending on the laws in your state, children especially there are emancipation laws depending on age. But also, how do you create these like pods of support with friends, families, or with other families outside of the system or outside of the family system, or even other families in the family system that would trust them? How do you get the community to start dreaming and designing together with that victim, how we get them out, how we get them safe, and then how we get them to learn a sense of safety and a new baseline so they can live a fulfilling life. So that's great news, and thank you for sharing. It's always hard to keep up with the different law changes.
Yeah, we did not even get into reporting that much because there are 56 state and territories and there are 56 sets of laws. So
yeah,
absolutely. Nora, there's another question in the Q&A, and I think this might be our last one. If you still have them, let me know and I will forward them on to Joe. But I think this might be our last question to make sure we're ending on time today.
Okay, we have another question. And this is Nora again, if we do referrals to your website, can we find support or services in Spanish for our Spanish-speaking participants?
That is a great question. Let me see, hold on for 1 second. I know that when we first published the website, we published one, yeah, we published one page at least in Spanish. And again, we would love to have more diversity and inclusivity, but because we're not funded, it's just like finding, the resources. But there is a Spanish page. If you go onto Incest Aware and then scroll down to the bottom, there is a link in the footer that says in Español, and that is a page in Spanish. And then there's a book that was just released by a researcher in Texas called Family Secrets, Incest. It's like Family Secrets in Incest Within Mexican Families or something like that. And it does I imagine it's in Spanish. So that is a great note for me to keep thinking about how we diversify in language and opportunity. But until then, would love to, again, support, getting some of those resources created together.
Okay, and I think we do have time for maybe one more question.
Okay.
Nora, if you could read that last one. Thank you.
Sounds great. This is Nora with the last question. In some rural communities, generational trauma has contributed to instances of incest, particularly involving children. How can we begin outreach and education efforts in a way that helps children understand that incest is not normal or acceptable while being mindful of the trauma and culture involved?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, right? And that's a great question around constraint that we talked about with design thinking, right? That it's like, okay, we have these opportunities and these barriers, and how do we think around this? So, it's really interesting. I don't know if you're aware of how recycling became like so disseminated in the United States, but recycling was like invented as a program, and then they taught children about recycling, and then children educated their parents on it. And then that is how recycling became kind of so popularized, at least in some areas of the United States. So that's one method. We don't always want to put all this pressure on children. And I think more and more there's like this need to like really, focus on adults, educate adults. I would just say that every community's access point is going to be different. So like, what is your access point into your community? Is it the kids? Is it the elders? Is it the adults? Is it like school programming? Is it through the medical field? Like, where do you feel like you're just going to get your foot in the door? Because we're not, with incest activism, because it's so stigmatized, we're not trying to scale anything quickly, right? Like pacing yourself, doing it slowly, expecting backlash, taking it one step at a time, I have found to be most effective. So the question is, in your community, how do you get your foot just in the door? And then see what happens, and then like go to the next step, So I know that's not the most practical idea, but I don't want to give you ideas without really understanding more about your specific context.
Okay. Thank you all so much. So thank you all so much for coming today. This webinar will be posted and recorded on the RSP website. If you came today, you will please do the evaluation at the end of our webinar. Joe, thank you so much for coming. Part 1 is already recorded and available on our YouTube channel, and I will repost the link for those who attended today because the link I posted isn't working. That's okay. And we will have part 3 of this series. That registration is not yet available, but please be on the lookout for our listserv for that announcement. Joe, 100 thank yous. Thank you so much for coming. Nora has already put Joe's information in the chat once again. And if you all have any more questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.